Long live the Queen, or maybe not. Elizabeth I ruled for nearly 45 years, outliving rivals, dodging plots, and surviving an age that killed most people young. But in the end, even the most powerful monarch wasn't immune to a mysterious decline that left historians debating for centuries. No dramatic coronation this time, just fading health, unanswered questions, and a goodbye no one was prepared for. If you enjoyed diving into history's biggest mysteries, a like or subscribe would be really appreciated. And honestly, drop where you're listening from and the time. It's still surreal seeing the whole world tuned into the same story. All right, tonight we unravel what may have caused the death of Elizabeth I. So get comfy, relax, and let's step into the final mystery of the Virgin Queen.
By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth I was approaching her 70th year, an age few reached in Tudor England. Her skin, once powdered into porcelain perfection, had begun to betray the fragility beneath. Her brilliant auburn wigs, once symbols of youthful power, now sat atop a body weathered by nearly half a century of rule. For 44 years she had reigned alone. She'd outlived rivals, buried suitors, and silenced every threat that rose against her. But now the iron will that had defined the Queen was beginning to crack. Though her mind was still sharp, those around her noticed something was shifting. Her appetite had waned. Her presence at court had grown sporadic. The fire that once radiated from her throne at Whitehall seemed dimmed, and with the turning of the year, rumours began to whisper through the tapestried halls of Richmond Palace. Rumours that their sovereign was fading. There had been loss, painful personal loss. The execution of Robert Devo, the Earl of Essex, in 6001 had struck a deep blow. Though he had betrayed her, leading a failed rebellion and attempting to seize power, Elizabeth I had loved him in her own way. Some said it was motherly affection, others whispered of something deeper. Regardless, watching him walk to the scaffold tore at her. She never truly recovered from that grief. In her final winter, she would spend long hours standing, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat. Servants noted that she rarely sat, and even less did she speak. When she did, her voice was thin, trailing like smoke. Sometimes she would gaze into the empty fireplace for hours, unmoving, as if staring into something far beyond it, something only she could see. The court began to prepare. Physicians offered tinctures, tonics, and prayers, but the Queen dismissed them all. Ministers gently urged her to rest, to speak, to name a successor. But the once commanding monarch only shook her head. Something weighed on her heart, heavier than politics, heavier perhaps than the crown itself. As March approached, one truth began to settle among those closest to her. The reign of Elizabeth I was quietly, painfully coming to an end. As the days passed, the gloom that filled Elizabeth I's private chamber at Richmond Palace deepened. The once vibrant court, famous for its music, pageantry, and lively discourse, had grown hushed. The Queen, who had dazzled Europe with her wit and resolve, was now wrapped in heavy silks, surrounded by shadows and silence. She no longer held council meetings, nor did she take her usual rides or walks in the gardens. Her ladies-in-waiting, the closest and most trusted women in her life, were dismissed one by one from her room until she remained mostly alone. Even the few she allowed to stay, such as Lady Scrow, spoke only in soft, uncertain tones, unsure if their presence comforted or agitated her. Her mind, they whispered, was slipping. It was during this time that her physicians began to observe something troubling. Not only was the Queen refusing food, she'd also started to resist sleep altogether. She would stand for hours on end, rooted to the same spot by her bed or by the window, as if the very act of lying down might bring death closer. When her legs could no longer support her, she would sit stiffly on cushions, eyes fixed on some invisible point, lips moving silently in prayer or thought. Some speculated that she feared death not as a woman, but as a ruler. For decades, Elizabeth I had been the embodiment of England itself. To die meant to relinquish control of her people, her image, and her power. Perhaps that was what she truly feared, the end of control. Physically, her health began to decline in ways subtle but certain. She developed a persistent cough, her skin turned increasingly pale, and her frame seemed to shrink beneath her ornate gowns. The weight loss was alarming, yet she forbade any attempt to examine her too closely. Her vanity, even in sickness, remained intact, and through it all, one question loomed in every courtier's mind, but was rarely voiced aloud. Was this simply old age catching up to the Queen, or was something hidden, festering beneath the surface? The answer, for now, remained locked behind her lips, lips that once commanded empires now barely moved at all. To understand the weight pressing down on Elizabeth I in her final weeks, one must look not only at her body, but at her heart, and more precisely at the ghost that haunted it, Robert Deo, the Earl of Essex. Their relationship had been volatile. Essex was dashing, ambitious and impulsive. He flattered her, defied her, then begged for forgiveness, only to betray her again. In him, Elizabeth saw both potential and peril. Despite his arrogance, she had favoured him, elevating him to great influence within her court. But in time, his ambition turned dangerous. In 6001, he launched a coup, a desperate, ill-conceived rebellion to seize power. She had no choice. The crown could not tolerate treason, no matter how charming the traitor. Elizabeth signed the death warrant herself, and when he was beheaded in the Tower of London, something inside her unravelled. From that moment forward, witnesses say the Queen began to change. It wasn't just sadness. It was as if a deep, corrosive guilt had lodged itself in her soul. Some claimed she carried a locket containing his portrait. Others swore she muttered his name in the dead of night. Whether these tales were true or the invention of romantic courtiers, the effect was undeniable. The Queen who had once seemed untouchable now appeared human and deeply wounded. Grief in that age was poorly understood. What we now recognise as depression might have been seen as melancholia, a spiritual imbalance rather than an emotional one. But those around her saw it clearly. Her eyes had dulled, her laughter ceased, her energy faded. The courtiers who had once competed for her affection now stepped more cautiously. They feared her moods, unsure how far her sorrow might drag her down. She stopped composing letters. She stopped approving documents. She even stopped attending chapel, a sign more shocking than any given her deeply Protestant faith. And perhaps most telling of all, she refused music. Elizabeth I had adored music all her life. She had sung, played instruments, and surrounded herself with composers and poets. Now she asked for silence. The Queen's heart, it seemed, had broken long before her body followed. As March of 6003 drew near, the decline of Elizabeth I was no longer hidden. What began as grief and withdrawal was now a public spectacle. Her slow, tragic unravelling witnessed by nobles, courtiers and servants alike. The once commanding sovereign, who had outwitted kings and silenced dissenters, now seemed adrift within her own palace. She would not speak of her condition. In fact, she barely spoke at all. She answered questions with gestures or simple nods. Days passed without a full sentence leaving her lips. When her advisers pressed her for guidance on affairs of state, on the matter of succession, or on her own health, she turned away, retreating into herself as if words had become too heavy to lift. Physicians summoned in increasing urgency debated her symptoms. Some believe she suffered from a settling of humours, the vague TUDA diagnosis for mental or physical imbalance. Others suggested a cold distemper of the brain, but no one could agree on a cure because no one could truly understand the cause. At this time, her physical posture became symbolic of her mental state. She refused to lie down for hours, even days. She remained upright, sometimes leaning against cushions, sometimes gripping the arms of her chair, but never fully reclining. It was as though she believed that surrendering to sleep would mean surrendering to death. Servants would later report how the Queen stood silently in the corner of her room, cloaked in heavy black, unmoving for hours at a time. At night they took turns watching her, unsure whether she was praying, mourning, or simply lost. The palace around her seemed to fall into a hush. Courtiers spoke in whispers. Nobles paced outside her door, anxious for news, and all the while the air grew thick with unspoken fear. Not just of losing their queen, but of what might come after. The realm had no clear heir. And though Elizabeth had long refused to name one, everyone suspected that James V of Scotland would be chosen. But without her voice, without her seal, would her will be honoured. England was no stranger to power struggles, and a queen's silence could turn into a nation's chaos. The silence was no longer just hers, it was England's holding its breath. Among the many whispered theories about Elizabeth I's death, one stands out. Not because of its drama, but because of its slow, invisible nature. It wasn't a sword or poisoned goblet that may have killed her, but rather something far more insidious, her makeup. For decades, the Queen had adorned her face with a signature white mask of beauty, a thick layer of cosmetic powder known as Venetian Sousse. It was a fashion born from the aristocracy designed to signal nobility, purity and wealth. The mixture, however, contained two key ingredients, vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead, a metal we now know to be toxic, even in small quantities. Applied daily, layer upon layer, this lead-based makeup was absorbed through the skin. Over time it could damage the nervous system, weaken the muscles, cloud the mind, and ultimately shorten the lifespan. The symptoms of lead poisoning read like a shadowed list of Elizabeth's final months. Fatigue, depression, tremors, loss of appetite, cognitive decline, and skin deterioration. Her contemporaries noted that her teeth had blackened and fallen out. Her hair, once bright and flame red, had thinned and disappeared. Her skin, beneath the paint, was marked by sores and blemishes, signs that were hidden from the public behind pearl-studded wigs and powdered masks. And yet the Queen remained committed to the illusion. She insisted on presenting the image of eternal youth, even as her body rebelled. That makeup was not just vanity, it was armour. And like any armour, it came with weight, in this case, a poisonous one. Some modern historians believe that long-term lead exposure may have contributed significantly to her physical and mental decline, the irritability, the confusion, the refusal to sleep or eat. Even the depression that followed the death of Robert Devo might have been magnified by chemical imbalance. But in her day, no one understood these dangers. Venetian Suze was celebrated. It was even imported and used across Europe. The very thing that made Elizabeth I iconic may have also been one of the slowest, most cruel contributors to her downfall. In the end, the white mask that defined her public image may have also quietly hastened the fading of the woman beneath it. By the second week of March 6003, the condition of Elizabeth had become undeniable. Her courtiers now moved with urgency, though careful not to show panic. The Queen had stopped eating entirely. Her body, already thin, seemed to retreat into itself, her bones visible beneath the ornate fabrics that once projected power and grace. She was wasting away, and yet no one could give her illness a name. Tudor medicine had no clear diagnostic tools. There were no thermometers, no microscopes, no concept of infection as we know it. Illness was a matter of humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile. If those were imbalanced, disease followed. Treatments involved bleeding, herbal pecuses, or purging the system. And yet none of these worked because no one truly understood what was happening inside the Queen. Modern scholars have suggested that she may have succumbed to pneumonia. The cold air in Richmond Palace mixed with long hours of standing and fasting may have led to a lung infection. A persistent cough, chills, and a slow slide into delirium align with such a theory. And without antibiotics, even a muzzled case of pneumonia was potentially fatal. Others speculate blood poisoning, possibly due to abscessed teeth or infected sores under her cosmetics. Dental hygiene was poor, and Elizabeth had already lost several teeth. Infections in the mouth, if left untreated, could enter the bloodstream, a deadly condition known today as septicemia. But none of these possibilities could be confirmed in her time, and so her physicians guessed. They used herbal tonics, tried warm compresses, and prayed. But Elizabeth would have none of it. She rejected all medicine. She would not allow incisions nor bleedings. She even refused to undress completely, guarding her modesty to the very end. And through it all she said almost nothing. The silence around her became part of the illness. Her servants tiptoed. Her ladies wept in private. Her ministers watched helpless as the one figure who had dominated their lives for decades began to vanish. Not in a blaze, but like a candle slowly dying in its holder. No one could help her. No one even knew what to call it. And so they simply waited for the end or a miracle. Though her body was failing, it wasn't illness alone that burdened Elizabeth I. It was the immense, inescapable weight of rule. For over 4 decades she had stood as the embodiment of England. Her crown was not just a symbol of power, it was a living thing, fed by every decision she made, every speech she delivered, and every threat she outwitted. But now, in the stillness of her chamber, that crown sat heavy and unclaimed, and the question of what came next loomed over the dying Queen like a storm. Elizabeth had no children, no direct heir. The Tudor line, so fiercely defended and glorified, was ending with her. And though she had maintained a lifetime of political control, she had long resisted naming a successor. Why? Perhaps because naming one meant acknowledging her own mortality, something she had stubbornly refused to do. The most obvious candidate was James V of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had executed decades prior. He was male, Protestant, and had a legitimate claim through his great-great-grandmother Margaret Tudor. But his rise to the English throne would not be simple. Factions existed, old grudges remained, Catholic claimants still lurked in the shadows. As the Queen's strength faded, pressure mounted on her to make a formal declaration. Ministers, especially Robert Seel, the Secretary of State, pressed gently but firmly. England could not be left rudderless. Civil war was not a memory so distant as to be forgotten, and in a world where monarchs ruled by divine right, the death of a queen without clear succession was a recipe for chaos. But Elizabeth remained silent. Some say she gestured when asked if James should be king. Perhaps a subtle nod, perhaps nothing at all. Others claim she whispered, "I will have no rascal to succeed me," only to later accept the inevitable. But there is no record, no firm confirmation. The monarch who had delivered some of history's most memorable speeches would not speak her final decision. It is possible that in her mind acknowledging a successor was equal to surrendering, to admitting that her story, her dynasty and her era were truly coming to a close, and perhaps that was more painful than death itself. As March drew on and the hours grew colder, those attending Elizabethanverse faced a peculiar and increasingly disturbing reality. The Queen refused to sleep, not occasionally but entirely. Days and nights blended into one endless vigil as she remained seated or standing in her chamber, eyes distant, spirit detached. To many it seemed that the Queen was terrified not of death, but of what lay between her and death: rest. There were moments when her attendants begged her to lie down, but she resisted with such force that they stopped asking. Her refusal wasn't rooted in stubbornness alone. It carried the weight of superstition and sorrow. In Tudor times, sleep was often viewed as a temporary death, a time when the soul drifted dangerously close to the beyond. And Elizabeth I, despite her formidable logic and intellect, may have believed that if she closed her eyes she would never open them again. And so she sat, sometimes hunched in her chair, other times leaning against the wall. She defied the limitations of her failing body. The swelling in her legs worsened. Her breathing grew shallow, but still she would not lie in bed. Her servants tried to coax her with music. She turned it away. They brought warm drinks. She waved them off. She did not wish to be comforted nor convinced. It was as if she was standing watch over her own death, refusing to give it an invitation. Eventually, her strength began to betray her. She collapsed several times. On one occasion she was found crumpled beside her chair, unwilling to cry out for help. After that her ladies-in-waiting took turns staying close, hovering like ghosts of the court she had once commanded. Even they no longer spoke to her, unless spoken to first. The atmosphere in the room was one of reverence, sorrow, and dread. When at last she agreed to lie in bed, it was not from peace, but from exhaustion. Her body had given out. She was placed beneath the covers gently, like a fragile relic being lowered into silk. It was the first time she had rested in days, and for many it felt like the beginning of the end. The moment Elizabeth I allowed herself to be laid in bed, her chamber transformed. The silence grew heavier, more sacred. Those closest to her gathered, advisers, ladies, physicians, each one aware that this was not just the death of a woman, but the closing of an age. The Tudor dynasty, which had ruled England for over a century, was ending with her final breath. The room was dim. Tapestries muffled footsteps, candles flickered, Outside, the palace held its breath. No proclamations were issued, no bells tolled. Only whispers passed through the corridors of Richmond Palace. Those who had served her for decades now found themselves standing still, waiting for a word, a sign, a farewell that would never come. Despite the gravity of the moment, Elizabeth I said nothing. She'd once been a queen of eloquence. Her words could rouse armies, silence parliaments, and charm foreign courts. But now, as she drifted between consciousness and sleep, not a single parting phrase escaped her lips, not to her ladies, not to her council, not even to the realm she had so long protected. Instead, she communicated through faint movements, slight nods, flickers of the eyes, the barest tremble of her hands. Some thought they saw her reach toward the crown resting nearby. Others claimed she gestured toward a portrait of James V, VI, the presumed successor. But there were no declarations, no final speech to echo through history. What did she see lying there in silence? Perhaps visions from her reign. The young girl imprisoned by her sister Mary, the triumphant queen greeting the troops at Tilbury, the glittering court of poets and explorers, the fires of religious wars, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, the death of the Earl of Essex, a life of power shadowed by solitude. Outside her chamber, preparations had already begun. Courtiers quietly packed their belongings. Ambassadors wrote coded letters to their kings. Messengers waited with horses ready. They all knew what came next, and yet, until the last moment, England remained a kingdom without a sovereign. For until her last breath, Elizabeth I was still queen. No one could take her place. Not yet. Not until she was gone. As the final hours of Elizabeth I's life unfolded, those who remained in her chamber stood like statues, silent, sorrowful, and uncertain. The Queen no longer responded to touch or sound. Her breathing had grown shallow, irregular. Her skin, pale from age and illness, now took on an ashen hue. The fire in her had gone from a steady flame to a flickering ember. Lady Screw, one of her most faithful attendants, refused to leave her side. She held the Queen's hand and dabbed her brow with linen soaked in rosewater. Others stood in the background whispering prayers, some aloud, others in their hearts. There was no ritual for this. There had never been a monarch like her before. Outside, Richmond Palace was wrapped in a quiet anxiety. No proclamation had yet been made, and still no one dared call her death until the final breath passed. Messengers stood ready at the gates, prepared to ride to Scotland the moment it was confirmed, to deliver the news to James V, the man who would be king. Inside, time seemed to warp. The minutes dragged like hours, and no one dared speak of what would come next. Even Robert Seel, the chief architect of the peaceful transition to the House of Stuart, stood still, his papers folded in his hand. His greatest political manoeuvre, uniting England and Scotland under one crown, was moments away, yet entirely dependent on a woman in her final moments. Then, just before dawn on March the 24th, 603, it happened. No cry, no gasp, just silence. The room remained motionless for a full minute, as if all feared the breath might return. Then, quietly, Lady Scrow covered the Queen's face with the linen cloth. It was over. Elizabeth I was dead. Her passing was not marked with fanfare, nor even with the priest's final rites. She had refused them all. The Virgin Queen, as she was so often called, had died alone, surrounded not by family or heirs, but by the weight of history. a monarch born of scandal who ruled through storms and fire, now passed into legend with the same dignity she held in life. Quiet, unbending, and ultimately unknowable, the death of Elizabeth I sent a chill across the kingdom. Not because it was unexpected, but because of what it left behind. A throne without a voice, a court without direction, and a realm uncertain of its next heartbeat. She had been the only monarch many in England had ever known. Her presence was woven into the fabric of everyday life, her image stamped onto coin and conscience alike. Now that image was still. Immediately after her death, her body was left undisturbed. According to tradition, her ladies kept vigil beside her, whispering psalms through trembling lips. A single candle burned at her bedside. The cloth over her face did not conceal her identity. It preserved it as though the nation needed one final moment to believe she was truly gone. But while grief settled inside the walls of Richmond elsewhere, wheels were already turning. Robert Seel, perhaps the only man who truly understood the scale of this moment, stepped into motion. His secret correspondences with James V of Scotland prepared for this day. The couriers were sent, riding with breathless urgency through muddy spring roads, carrying news that would transform two kingdoms. Meanwhile, back in London, the people waited. No bells rang, no mourning was declared. The court kept the death quiet for several hours, fearing unrest or opportunistic power plays. But word eventually seeped out, first through servants, then to merchants and clergy. The Queen was gone, and with her so too went the tutor. There was no child, no sibling, no cousin raised at her side to step into her place. Elizabeth had left behind no personal heir, only the political hope that her choice, unspoken but widely assumed, would be honoured. The Privy Council met in hushed tones. The moment was fragile. A kingdom needed direction and fast. The fear of factionalism, of Catholic uprisings, of foreign meddling, all these haunted their thoughts. The bloodshed of past successions loomed like a shadow. Yet the Queen's long silence had not stopped her government from preparing. Within hours of her death, the Council declared that James V of Scotland would become James I of England. A new dynasty began. But even as the nation turned toward the future, it did so in mourning for the woman who had shaped an age and left behind a silence no crown could fill. After the council announced the succession of James VI, now James I of England, the focus shifted to the care of the Queen's body. Elizabeth I, who had guarded her image with almost obsessive control throughout her reign, could no longer maintain the illusion. The mask she'd worn, both literal and symbolic, was beginning to fall away. In life she had been meticulous about appearances. She rarely allowed herself to be seen without her full regalia, the white lead makeup, the elaborate gowns, the fiery wigs. Even in her final days she kept her chamber darkened and denied most visitors. Vanity, yes, but also power. To appear weak was to risk everything in a court filled with ambition and knives. Now in death, her body told a different story. As her ladies gently prepared her for burial, they began to see what had long been hidden beneath layers of silk and powder. Her skin bore the signs of age and illness, bruising, lesions, and the pale unnatural hue from years of toxic cosmetics. Her hands, once adorned with rings and sceptres, were thin and bony. Her hair, what little remained, had turned wispy and white. There was no denying it. Elizabeth I had been dying long before she allowed anyone to see it. And yet in death, there was something profound about her humanity. She was no longer Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, or the untouchable monarch on coins and canvases. She was a woman who had carried a kingdom on her back for 4 decades and paid the price with her body. No embalming was done immediately. The tradition at the time was to delay the burial to allow time for national mourning and for proper ceremony. Her body lay in state, dressed one final time in royal robes, crown placed above her brow, orb and sceptre at her side. For all the imperfections now visible, her people still came to pay respects not just to the queen she had been, but to the person she had become. A woman of contradictions, powerful and alone, brilliant and burdened, fierce and fragile. The mask had slipped away, but what remained was not less regal, only more real. On April the 28th, 603, more than a month after her death, the body of Elizabeth I was finally laid to rest. The delay had not been caused by negligence, but by reverence. England had lost its longest reigning monarch to date, and such a passing demanded a ceremony that would match the magnitude of her legacy. Her funeral procession began at Whitehall, and moved slowly toward Westminster Abbey. The streets of London were lined with mourners, nobles, clergy, commoners. Thousands of faces turned toward the carriage that bore their queen one final time. Some wept, others stood in solemn silence. There were no cheers, no songs, only the tolling of bells and the shuffle of boots on stone. The coffin was draped in velvet and borne upon a massive hearse drawn by 4 horses. Above it sat an effigy of Elizabeth I, dressed in state robes with crown, orb and sceptre, eyes open, face serene, as if still watching over her people. The image was so lie-like that many believed it to be her real body, propped upright in death. Behind the hearse marched an honour guard followed by the nobles of her court, members of Parliament, and ambassadors from foreign nations. Each step echoed the weight of transition. A queen was being buried, but an entire era was being mourned. At Westminster Abbey she was interred in the vault beside her half-sister, Mary I, a symbolic reunion between 2 queens once bitterly divided by religion and rivalry. On the tomb, the inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." The irony was not lost on historians. In life, the sisters had been enemies. In death, they lay side by side. The funeral marked more than the end of a monarch. It marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. With Elizabeth gone, so too ended the lineage that had brought England out of the Wars of the Roses and into an age of exploration, cultural flourishing, and national pride. And as the Abbey's great doors closed behind her, an entire kingdom stood changed. The Elizabethan age was over. What came next would be shaped by a different hand and a different crown. More than 4 centuries have passed since Elizabeth I took her final breath, and yet the mystery surrounding her death remains. Unlike monarchs who died in battle or by clear illness, Elizabeth's decline was veiled in silent secrecy and contradictions. As a result, scholars, physicians and curious minds have continued to speculate what exactly killed the Virgin Queen. The most common theory is simple: old age. At nearly 70 years old, Elizabeth had far outlived most of her contemporaries. After 4 decades of rule and countless personal losses, her body may have simply succumbed to time. Her refusal to eat, drink, or rest certainly contributed to her decline, and without modern medicine, even a minor ailment could turn fatal. Another compelling theory is pneumonia. The Queen reportedly caught a chill shortly before her final decline. Cold, damp conditions in Richmond Palace combined with her weakened state may have allowed an infection to take root. With no antibiotics and only rudimentary treatments, pneumonia would have been devastating. Yet other theories point to lead poisoning. Her famous white makeup, Venetian Suze, was known to contain white lead, a toxic substance absorbed through the skin. Over decades, it could have damaged her organs, caused psychological changes, and slowly poisoned her from within. Symptoms such as fatigue, irritability, and cognitive decline all match modern understandings of chronic lead exposure. Then there is the possibility of blood poisoning, perhaps from an infected tooth or sore. Dental health was notoriously poor, and Elizabeth had suffered tooth loss and decay. A small infection could easily have entered her bloodstream, resulting in septicemia, a silent killer in an era without understanding of bacteria or sterilization. Finally, some historians explore the emotional and psychological toll, grief and depression. The loss of Robert Devo and other beloved confidants seemed to break something within her. Her refusal to lie down, her long silences, her deep melancholy, all could be signs of profound psychological suffering, which untreated may have hastened her end. In truth, it may have been all of these factors: age, illness, poison, grief, woven together in a tapestry of decline. A queen who carried an empire may have finally been crushed beneath its weight. And yet in her silence she left no confession, only a legend. Elizabeth I's death was not merely the clothes of a life, it was the clothes of an identity that England had worn for more than 40 years. She had reigned alone, without husband or child, carving her image into the very soul of a nation. Her passing was quiet, private, and full of unanswered questions. But the echo of her reign thundered into the centuries that followed. The country she left behind was vastly different from the one she inherited. When she first ascended the throne in 1558, England was fractured by religious war, threatened by foreign powers, and teetering on the edge of instability. Through sheer will, political genius, and theatrical leadership, Elizabeth I transformed it into a formidable kingdom, confident, culturally vibrant, and respected on the world stage. Her death, however, revealed the fragility beneath that surface. She had held everything together through force of personality and presence. With her gone, a power vacuum threatened to reopen old wounds. The peaceful transition to James I marked a diplomatic victory, but also a seismic shift. The Tudor flame had gone out. The Stuart dawn was uncertain, and yet what lingered in the minds of her people wasn't just the politics, it was her persona. The speeches at Tilbury, the defiant rejection of marriage, the cultivated image of the Virgin Queen, the jewels, the gowns, the high forehead, the poetic rhetoric. All of it became mythic. Even her final silence served her legacy. She exited the world on her own terms, offering no final word, no dying gasp for legacy or pity. In life, she'd been a master of performance. In death, she let the silence speak louder than any closing act. To this day, historians still debate the details of her death, but few debate her impact. The Elizabethan age remains one of the most celebrated periods in English history. Her name became shorthand for a golden era of poetry, exploration, and national pride. And though her body rests quietly beneath the stones of Westminster Abbey, her story continues to live in pages, on stages, and in the very spirit of the monarchy she once ruled. She died alone, But she did not die forgotten. Long before chocolate bars lined grocery store shelves and hot cocoa warmed winter hands, cacao was something entirely different. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't even eaten. It was drunk, bitter, frothy, and sacred. And for the ancient peoples of Mesoamerica, this strange, powerful bean held more than flavour. It held meaning. Our story begins over 3,000 years ago, deep in the tropical rainforests of what is now southern Mexico. The Olmec, considered one of the first complex civilizations in the Americas, were likely the earliest people to cultivate the cacao tree. Though much of their history is shrouded in mystery, archaeologists believe Thames used cacao in rituals and possibly as a ceremonial drink consumed by elite leaders or shamans. It was no ordinary refreshment. It was a vessel for spiritual power. But it was with the Maya civilization that cacao truly became a divine gift. The Maya, whose empire spanned much of Central America from around 250 to 900 CE, worshipped cacao as a sacred plant bestowed by the gods. According to their mythology, cacao was a gift from the gods of creation, part of the very foundation of human life. The Pulvu, a sacred Maya text, describes the gods forming humans from maize and cacao, binding them to the natural world. Cacao was reserved for important moments. Priests offered it during religious ceremonies. Nobles drank it during elaborate feasts. It was believed to invigorate the spirit and open a gateway to the divine. Served cold and mixed with chili, spices or cornmeal, the cacao drink was rich, intense and energizing. Often it was poured from vessel to vessel to create a frothy foam, a sign of prestige and quality. But cacao's value went even deeper than ritual. Maya markets used cacao beans as currency. A few beans could buy a tamale. 100 could buy a turkey. People stored them like money, traded them, and even made counterfeit versions from clay. To the Mer, chocolate wasn't a treat. It was life, power, wealth, and worship all in one. It was the drink of the gods, flowing through the veins of kings and priests, and its bitter, intoxicating taste marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable culinary journeys in human history. Among the Maya, cacao was more than a beverage. It was a living symbol of divine order woven into the very fabric of daily life and cosmic belief. This small bitter bean from the jungle was thought to be a sacred substance, capable of connecting mortals to the gods, the earth, and the afterlife. In every major Maya city from Tikal to Copan, cacao was present at the most important moments of life. When rulers were crowned, cacao was poured. When marriages were sealed, it was drunk by both bride and groom. And when the dead were laid to rest, vessels of cacao accompanied them into the tomb, offerings meant to nourish their souls in the next world. Cacao was commonly consumed during religious ceremonies, often by the priestly and elite classes. These drinks were not sweet, nor were they taken casually. They were blended with chili peppers, maize, vanilla, and sometimes even blood. A powerful combination intended to invigorate the spirit and induce visions. It was believed that drinking cacao could bring one closer to the divine, opening the mind to prophecy or sacred insight. The Maya also believed cacao trees were sacred. Their curved branches and brightly coloured pods symbolized life, fertility, and abundance. In art, cacao often appeared alongside gods and ancestral spirits. On painted ceramics and carved stele, you can see scenes of kings offering cacao to deities, or gods themselves emerging from the pods as if born of divine fruit. But cacao's role extended beyond religion. It was a staple of the social and economic world. Hosting a guest, you served cacao. Negotiating peace, you drank cacao together. For the mayor, to share cacao was to recognize shared humanity, an unspoken contract of trust, respect, and elevated purpose. Even in the homes of the wealthy, cacao drinking was ceremonial. Special vessels were used, beautifully painted cups, often marked with glyphs identifying the owner and the specific purpose of the drink. These weren't just dishes, they were heirlooms crafted with care and reverence. The reverence for cacao shaped the Maya identity. It was not just consumed, it was celebrated, revered, and trusted as a bridge between realms. In a world ruled by ritual and cosmic cycles, cacao was the drink that kept the universe in balance. Centuries after the Emma, another mighty civilization would rise and elevate cacao even further: the Aztecs. By the time Hernán Cortés and the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, cacao was not just a spiritual symbol or luxury item in the Aztec Empire. It was an institution used as money, medicine, and a royal indulgence. The Aztecs didn't grow cacao in the cool, dry climate of their capital, Tenochtitlan. Instead, they acquired it through trade or tribute. Conquered provinces in warmer southern regions were required to send cacao beans as payment to the imperial centre. Tons of beans flowed into the empire's coffers, stored in granaries like modern banks. Each bean had value. A small rabbit could cost 10 beans. A turkey hen might cost 100. Servants were paid in cacao. Debts were settled with it. To counterfeit a cacao bean, to hollow one out and fill it with dirt was a serious crime. In Aztec society, cacao was as valuable as gold, but its worth went beyond economics. Cacao, known as Xochitl, was revered as a warrior's drink. It was consumed by nobles, priests, and military leaders, never by commoners. Prepared with water, chili, and sometimes maize, it is believed to energize the body and sharpen the mind before battle. Emperor Moctezuma II is said to have consumed as many as 50 cups a day, believing it to be an aphrodisiac and a source of strength. Cacao was also a key element in religious ceremonies. Offerings were made to deities like Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who, according to legend, gave cacao to humanity after stealing it from paradise.